What happens when one of Britain's most respected actors completely loses his cool on live daytime television? It only took 30 seconds for a friendly chat to explode into one of the most shocking meltdowns ever witnessed on Loose Women. Make sure you subscribe to this channel for daily videos exposing Hollywood's darkest scandals. Last night's episode of Loose Women was supposed to be a celebration. The panel had gathered around their familiar table, the studio decorated with photos from Michael Caine's legendary career spanning over 6 decades. Ruth Langsford sat in the center seat, her polished appearance perfect as always, wearing a cream blazer and her signature pearl necklace. The other panelists flanked her on either side, notes arranged neatly in front of them, ready to discuss everything from acting techniques to retirement plans. The studio audience filled every seat, excited whispers rippling through the crowd as they waited for one of cinema's greatest icons to join them. When Michael Caine walked onto the set, the applause was thunderous. The 89-year-old legend moved carefully but confidently across the studio floor, his famous glasses perched on his nose. Wearing an impeccably tailored navy suit, he waved to the audience with that recognizable smile, the one that had charmed moviegoers for generations. As he settled into the guest chair, adjusting his jacket and accepting a glass of water from a production assistant, the atmosphere felt warm and respectful. This was going to be a masterclass in storytelling from someone who'd lived an extraordinary life. Ruth leaned forward with practiced enthusiasm, her smile broad and welcoming. "Michael, it is such an honor to have you here with us today. You've had one of the most remarkable careers in film history, working with everyone from Sean Connery to Christian Bale. We're absolutely thrilled to talk to you about your incredible journey." Michael nodded graciously, his distinctive Cockney accent immediately recognizable. "Thank you, Ruth. It's lovely to be here. Though I have to say, this is a bit different from my usual morning routine of tea and the newspaper." The panel laughed, and one of the other hosts chimed in. "Well, we promise to make it worth your while. We've got so many questions about your amazing career, the iconic roles you've played, and what life looks like for you now." Ruth glanced down at her notes, then back up at Michael with a slightly sharper expression. "Now, Michael, you've been quite vocal recently about the state of modern cinema. You've said that films today lack the sophistication and craft of the classics you were part of. Some might say that sounds like someone who's out of touch with how storytelling has evolved. What do you say to that?" The warmth in Michael's expression cooled noticeably. His posture stiffened slightly as he adjusted his glasses. "Well, Ruth, I wouldn't say I'm out of touch. I'd say I have standards. There's a difference between evolution and deterioration. When I started in this business, actors learned their craft properly. We studied, we rehearsed, we respected the material and the audience. But surely you're not suggesting that today's actors don't work hard?" Ruth pressed, her tone taking on an edge. "I mean, the industry has changed dramatically. There are more opportunities now, more diverse voices telling stories that weren't being told before. Isn't that progress?" Michael leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "Progress? Perhaps in some ways. But when I see films today where everything is green screen and CGI, where actors don't even know what they're reacting to because it'll be added in post-production, I don't call that progress. I call that lazy filmmaking. When I did Zulu, we were in the actual location, dealing with real elements, creating something authentic." One of the other panelists jumped in, trying to lighten the mood. "I think what Michael is saying is that there's value in traditional methods, which is absolutely fair. Both approaches have their merits." But Ruth wasn't backing down. "With all due respect, Michael, Zulu was made in 1964. That was 60 years ago. The world has moved on. Technology has advanced. Are you really suggesting that we should still be making films the way they were made 6 decades ago? That seems rather backward-looking." "Backward-looking?" Michael's voice took on a harder edge. "I'm not saying we should reject technology. I'm saying we shouldn't let it replace craftsmanship. When you watch The Italian Job or Get Carter, you're watching real stunt work, real locations, Real danger. Today, everything is sanitized and computerized. There's no soul to it. Ruth set down her notes with a sharp tap against the table. So what you're essentially saying is that modern filmmakers have no soul? That seems like quite a sweeping generalization from someone who hasn't actually made a film in several years. When was your last major role, Michael? The studio audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the friendly celebration they'd expected. The other panelists exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to intervene or let it play out. Michael's eyes narrowed behind his glasses. My last film was 3 years ago, actually, and I chose to step back because I'd rather retire with dignity than participate in the rubbish that passes for cinema these days. I've nothing left to prove to anyone. Rubbish? Ruth's voice rose slightly. You're calling entire genres of filmmaking rubbish? Marvel films have brought joy to millions of people worldwide. They've created new icons for a new generation. Just because they're not to your taste doesn't make them worthless. I never said they were worthless, Michael corrected, his voice controlled but clearly irritated. I said they lack craft. There's a difference. Anyone can put on a costume and stand in front of a green screen reading lines. That's not acting. That's motion capture with a pulse. Another panelist tried to jump in. I think there's room for all kinds of cinema. Some people want spectacle, some want character studies. The beauty of film is its diversity. Diversity? Ruth cut her off, her attention still locked on Michael. That's interesting you bring that up, because I've noticed something about your legendary career, Michael. Looking through your filmography, there's a distinct pattern. How many of your leading ladies over the years were women of color? How many of your co-stars represented the diversity you're suddenly championing? Michael's face flushed red. That's completely out of order. I didn't cast those films. I was an actor doing my job. You're trying to make me responsible for decisions I had no control over. But you benefited from those decisions, didn't you? Ruth pressed forward, sensing she'd struck a nerve. You built your entire career in an industry that was predominantly white and male. And now you sit here criticizing modern cinema for trying to be more inclusive, for giving opportunities to people who wouldn't have had them in your day. That is not what I said. Michael's voice boomed through the studio, startling several audience members. Don't put words in my mouth. I never criticized diversity. I criticized lazy filmmaking. You're twisting everything I'm saying to fit some narrative you've decided on. The tension in the studio was palpable now. Crew members froze in place, cameras operators zooming in closer to capture every micro-expression. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of what was rapidly spiraling out of control. The air felt thick, electric with confrontation. Ruth's professional composure remained intact, but her eyes flashed with challenge, her body language aggressive and forward-leaning. I'm not twisting anything. I'm simply pointing out the contradiction between your nostalgia for the so-called golden age of cinema and the reality of who got to participate in that golden age. It's easy to praise the past when the past worked entirely in your favor. When you were the one getting all the opportunities while others were locked out. The past worked in my favor? Michael's voice dripped with incredulity, his famous accent growing thicker with emotion. Do you have any idea where I came from? Do you have the slightest clue about my background? I grew up in South London during the war. We were so poor we shared a bed between 3 of us. My father worked in a fish market. We didn't have indoor plumbing until I was a teenager. I fought for everything I achieved. Nobody handed me anything on a silver platter. I auditioned hundreds of times, got rejected more times than I can count. Yes, you've told that story many times, Ruth said, her tone dismissive and cold. We all know about your humble beginnings. It's very inspirational. You've dined out on that story for decades. But being working class doesn't mean you didn't benefit from being a white man in an industry that exclusively promoted white men. You can acknowledge your struggles and your privilege at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive concepts. One of the other panelists reached out tentatively, her voice shaking slightly. Ruth, Maybe we should move on to something else. Michael, tell us about your new book, your memoirs. I'm sure that's much more interesting than this. No, Michael said firmly, holding up his hand to silence her. I want to address this. I need to address this. Ruth, you invited me here under the pretense of celebrating my career, but what you're actually doing is putting me on trial for the crime of being successful. You're reducing 7 decades of work, of dedication, of craft, of blood and sweat and tears, down to my race and gender. That's not criticism, that's character assassination. That's you trying to score political points at my expense. Character assassination? Ruth laughed, but it was a cold sound, devoid of any genuine humor. You're being held accountable for your words. You came on this show and dismissed an entire generation of filmmakers and actors. You called modern cinema soulless and lazy. You basically said that everyone working in film today is inferior to your generation. And when challenged on that sweeping generalization, you're playing the victim. Poor Michael Caine, being asked to explain his statements. I'm not playing anything. Michael's hand slapped against the armrest of his chair, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the tense studio. I gave my honest opinion about the state of filmmaking, which I'm entitled to do after spending my entire adult life in this industry. I've earned that right through 60 years of hard work, of perfecting my craft. But you're not interested in my opinion. You're not interested in having a genuine discussion. You want to paint me as some bitter old man who's angry that the world has changed. Ruth leaned forward, her voice sharp as a blade, her expression hardening into something almost hostile. Aren't you? Because from where I'm sitting, that's exactly what this looks like. You're upset that films aren't made the way they were in your heyday. You're upset that new actors are getting opportunities without having to go through the same grueling process you did. You're upset that the industry you dominated for so long has moved on without you, that nobody's asking Michael Caine for his approval anymore. The studio went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the cameras, the shuffle of papers, someone's phone vibrating in the audience. Every eye was fixed on the two combatants, waiting to see what would happen next. Holding their collective breath, Michael stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh screech that made several people flinch. His face had gone from red to white, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. That is the most disrespectful, insulting thing anyone has ever said to me in my entire career. And I've worked with some real bastards over the years. Directors who screamed, producers who lied. But nobody has ever been as deliberately cruel as you're being right now. Michael, please sit down, one of the other panelists pleaded, her voice almost panicked, reaching out toward him with both hands. Please, let's just calm down and talk about this rationally. No, I will not sit down, Michael said, his voice ice cold, pulling away from her touch. I came here in good faith. I agreed to this appearance because I was told it would be a respectful conversation about my career and my life, about my experiences in cinema. Instead, I've been ambushed by someone who clearly has some kind of agenda, some point to prove. Ruth stood as well, matching his posture, refusing to let him have the high ground, literally or figuratively. Agenda? My agenda is holding people accountable for the things they say. You can't come on television, insult an entire generation of filmmakers, dismiss their work as soulless and lazy, and then act shocked when someone challenges you on it. You can't expect everyone to just nod along because your Michael Bloody Caine challenges me. You haven't challenged me. You've attacked me from the moment I sat down in this chair. There's a vast difference, though apparently you don't understand that. Michael began fumbling with the microphone clipped to his jacket, his fingers struggling with the small clip. You know what your problem is, Ruth? You think being confrontational is the same as being intelligent. You think asking rude questions makes you a serious journalist. But it doesn't. It just makes you rude. And you think being a legend gives you the right to say whatever you want without consequences. Ruth shot back, her professional mask slipping completely, her voice rising to match his volume. You think your fame insulates you from criticism? Well, it doesn't. Not anymore. Those days are over. This isn't 1965, where you can just say whatever you want and everyone nods along because you're Michael Caine. The world has changed, whether you like it or not. Don't you dare, Michael said, his voice low and dangerous, each word carefully enunciated. Don't you dare presume to tell me about my own era. You weren't there. You don't know what it was like. The sacrifices we made, the risks we took, the work we put in day after day, year after year. You sit here in your comfortable studio, with your autocue and your pre-written questions that someone else researched for you, and you judge people who actually created something lasting, something that will outlive all of us. Another panelist stood up now too, clearly distressed, her voice breaking. Please, both of you, can we just take a breath? This has gotten completely out of hand. We're colleagues. We're professionals. Let's remember that. Has it? Ruth turned to her colleague, her eyes blazing. Or is this exactly what needed to happen? How many times are we supposed to let these legendary figures come on our show and spout their outdated opinions without anyone questioning them? How long do we nod and smile while they dismiss everything that's happened in the last 20 years? How long do we pretend that their perspective is the only valid one? Michael finally got his microphone unclipped and held it in his hand, staring at it for a moment as if he couldn't quite believe this was happening. You want to know what's really outdated? This show, this format. Sitting around gossiping about people and calling it discourse, calling it journalism. I've done hundreds of interviews in my time, with everyone from Parkinson to Letterman. And this is hands down the worst experience I've ever had. The absolute worst. Well, that's fine, Ruth said, her voice sharp as glass, her words clipped and precise. Because this is the worst interview I've ever conducted. Usually our harm. Guests have the decency to treat us with respect, to treat me with respect. They don't come on and act like they're doing us some huge favor by gracing us with their presence. Respect? Michael's voice cracked slightly, emotion breaking through his controlled exterior. You want to talk about respect? You've spent the last 20 minutes trying to tear down everything I've achieved. You've questioned my credentials, my motivations, my entire legacy. You've tried to reduce my entire career to issues of race and privilege. And you want me to respect you for that? I question your opinions, Michael. Your opinions about modern cinema, which quite frankly are elitist and out of touch with reality. If you can't handle having your opinions challenged, if you can't defend your views when someone pushes back, maybe you shouldn't express them so loudly in public forums. Maybe you should keep them to yourself. Elitist? Michael laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and grating. That's rich, coming from someone who sits on national television telling people what they should think and how they should feel. You're not a journalist, Ruth. You're a bully with a microphone. You use your platform to attack people, and then you hide behind this facade of accountability and truth-telling. The audience gasped audibly, the sound rippling through the studio like a wave. Several people had their hands over their mouths in shock. Others were shaking their heads in disbelief. The other panelists looked absolutely horrified, frozen in their seats like statues, unsure of what to do, how to intervene, whether they should even try. Ruth's face had gone pale, then flushed red, her composure shattering before everyone's eyes. How dare you? How dare you come into this building, onto my show? You insult me. You insult what we do here. You dismiss our work, and then you have the audacity to call me a bully? After everything you've said today? Security! Get him off my set right now! Your set? Michael's voice was filled with contempt, every syllable dripping with disdain. This isn't your set. This is a television studio that will be here long after you're forgotten, long after your name means nothing to anyone. And trust me, you will be forgotten. Because you don't create anything, you just destroy. You tear people down and call it entertainment. You humiliate guests and call it holding them accountable. Get out! Ruth's voice cracked with emotion, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "Get out of this studio right now! We don't need you here! We don't need your outdated opinions, or your condescension, or your arrogance. Just go! Leave!" Michael held up the microphone he'd removed, dangling it from his fingers like a dead thing. "Don't worry, I'm leaving. I wouldn't stay here another second if you begged me on your knees. This whole thing has been an absolute disgrace. An absolute shambles. A complete waste of everyone's time." He dropped the microphone on the chair with a clatter that echoed through the silent studio, the sound sharp and final. One of the other panelists tried to reach out to him, tried to say something conciliatory, her hand outstretched, but he brushed past her without a glance, without acknowledgement. "You know what the real tragedy is?" Michael said, turning back one last time, his voice quieter now, but somehow more devastating. "I actually used to respect this show. I used to think you did important work, giving women a platform to discuss issues that matter, to share their perspectives. But this isn't important. This is just cruelty disguised as conversation. You should be ashamed of yourself, Ruth. Truly ashamed of what you've become." "I'm not ashamed of holding people accountable," Ruth shouted after him, but her voice wavered, betraying the emotion underneath. "I'm not ashamed of asking difficult questions. I'm not ashamed of challenging people who think they're above criticism." "Difficult questions?" Michael shook his head slowly, his expression one of profound disappointment, like a teacher watching a promising student fail. "You wouldn't know a difficult question if it bit you. All you know how to do is attack and then claim moral superiority when people defend themselves. That's not journalism. That's cowardice. That's hiding behind your position of power." A security guard had appeared at the edge of the set, a young man looking completely uncertain about what he was supposed to do, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Michael noticed him and held up his hand in a placating gesture. "Don't bother, mate. I'm going. Though I suspect you're not here for me. You're here to make it look like Ruth had control of the situation, when we all know she lost it about 15 minutes ago. This is damage control, not security." Ruth was breathing heavily now, her carefully styled hair slightly disheveled from all the movement, her makeup showing stress in the harsh studio lights. "You're a bitter, spiteful old man who can't accept that the world has moved on without you. That's what this is really about. You can't handle being irrelevant." "No," Michael said quietly, his voice suddenly calm and measured in contrast to the chaos around him. A stillness in the storm. "What this is about is you trying to make a name for yourself by taking down someone with a real legacy. You want to be known as the person who stood up to Michael Caine. You want this to go viral on social media, so people will talk about how brave you were. Well, congratulations. You got your moment. I hope it was worth sacrificing whatever integrity you had left." He turned toward the exit, his posture still dignified despite everything that had just happened, walking with the bearing of someone who had survived far worse than this. The cameras followed his every step as he walked across the studio floor, the distance seeming to stretch forever. "That's right, walk away," Ruth called after him, though now there was something desperate in her voice, something that sounded almost like regret, just like your generation always does when confronted with the truth. "Walk away and pretend nothing happened. Run away from accountability." Michael paused at the studio doors, his hand on the handle, his back to the cameras. For a moment, it looked like he might turn around, might say something else, might give them all one final piece of his mind. But then he just pushed through the doors with a firm shove and disappeared into the corridor beyond, leaving the studio in stunned, heavy silence. Ruth stood there, her chest heaving, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles had gone white. The other panelists sat frozen, their faces showing a mixture of shock, dismay, and confusion. One of them had tears streaming down her cheeks. The studio audience remained absolutely silent. No one knew what to do. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This had become something else entirely, something uncomfortable and raw. One of the producers finally found his voice, through Ruth's earpiece, telling her to go to commercial, to cut away, to do something. But Ruth just stood there, staring at the doors Michael had walked through. Another panelist finally stood and put her hand on Ruth's shoulder. "Are you okay?" Ruth shook her head slowly, whether in answer to the question or just in disbelief at what had just happened. It was impossible to tell. Her carefully constructed professional demeanor had completely crumbled. The cameras kept rolling for another few seconds, capturing Ruth's face as the reality of what had just occurred seemed to sink in. This wasn't a victory. This wasn't even a draw. This was a disaster that would be replayed and discussed for years to come. As the studio finally cut to commercial, the heavy doors through which Michael Caine had exited swung slowly shut with a soft thud that somehow felt louder than any of the shouting that had preceded it. Somewhere in the distance, his footsteps could be heard echoing down the corridor, growing fainter with each step, walking away from one of the most explosive confrontations in daytime television history.